So, and I don't know how I got away with this, but I got myself signed out of that hospital against medical advice, of course. Drove back to the mailbox, took the check out, cashed the check, went back to the casino, and 4 hours later, I was broke again. And that's when I knew.
Today I'm joined by someone who has turned his toughest battles into a mission to help others. Dave Yeager served 11 years in the US Army, where his life and career were deeply impacted by a gambling addiction. Since finding recovery, he's dedicated himself to breaking the stigma around this illness, especially in the military and veteran community. He's the author of Fall In, a veteran with a gambling addiction, and also the host of the Fall In podcast, which gives a voice to those who are struggling, shines a light on hope, recovery, and change. But today I want to put that spotlight right back onto Dave and hear about his experiences and his life so far. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Doing great, Daniel, and thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor.
No, I appreciate it. I'm in Australia, Dave's in America, so we're opposite ends of the day right now, and I appreciate the early start that you've dedicated for this. I'm going to ask you to get straight into it and tell me about your earliest memory of your earliest memory of gambling. Is there anything from your childhood or anything like that?
Yeah, no, not from my childhood. I will tell you that I grew up and still live in Pennsylvania in the eastern part of the US, which is about an hour and a half from Atlantic City, which prior to the overwhelming access we have to gambling today, when I was younger, it was one of two main cities you could go to gamble. It was either Las Vegas or Atlantic City. So in my 20s, I would drive into Atlantic City. I would take, a certain amount of money with me, a couple $100 with me. I'd go down there. I'd either run out of money or I would win some money, and then I would leave. And, I always left with gas money. I always left with something in my pocket and just enjoyed it. It was not really an issue for me. I didn't grow up around gambling. I grew up around alcoholism. Alcoholism was prevalent. My father, my stepfather, many of my uncles, I grew up knowing what alcoholism was and just basically promised myself I would never get caught up in alcoholism. Well, I got caught up in addiction. It just wasn't alcohol.
You were able to use the gambling as entertainment for all those years that you were going there.
Yeah, and it wasn't often. I mean, it was just every now and again, and I didn't do it. There was a large gap of time I didn't gamble at all. Maybe I would play some state lottery, or something like that, but it was one-off. It wasn't anything excessive.
Lead us up to when you joined the military. How you followed that path.
Excuse me. Yeah, I actually had two periods of service in the military. The first was from 1987 to 1991. Then took a 7-year break, and in the meantime, I got married. I had my children, and then got back into the military in 1998. Was stationed here in the United States, and then in 2000, late 2000, early 2001, came down on orders for a 1-year separated tour in the Republic of Korea. Um, which, you know, that was fine when the orders came down, although I can tell you that my first wife and I argued quite a bit about it because I did not want to reenlist for it. I wanted to get out. I wanted to get a job in the States. I wanted to take care of my family. She just felt like we needed to stay secure, all that sort of thing. And while that wasn't the overwhelming issue in our lives, it was a player in my stress level and all that. And then lo and behold, a month and a half before I left for Korea, 9/11 happened. So what was a daily life of putting on your uniform and going to work and that sort of thing suddenly became heightened stress, heightened awareness. Within a day at the military installation where I was, concrete barriers went up everywhere. There were armed guards at every gate. I mean, this was overnight, literally overnight after 9/11 happened. And here we are. This was September, obviously, that happened. In November, I was on a plane going to Korea. So I was extremely stressed. I was going to be away from my two young kids for an entire year. I was going to be away from my wife for an entire year. And oh, by the way, I'm flying into what the president at the time was calling part of the axis of evil. So I had no idea what to expect. It was a very, very, very tense time. So we fly into the country. We land at Osan Air Base. We take a shuttle up into Seoul, which is where the headquarters was and where I was going to process in before I finally went down to my station, which was in Pusan at the southern end of the peninsula, where I was to be the non-commissioned officer in charge of two squads, the squad in Pusan and then one an hour away in Taegu. So I had 15 soldiers I was accountable for. But I get into Seoul. They put me up in a really, really nice hotel right there on the base. And I'm walking around, and lo and behold, there's a casino-style slot room right there on the base. And the thing of it is, here in the US, in the States, they don't have them on the military bases here in the States. They just don't exist. But they do exist overseas. And that was something that it was back in the 80s. They created a resolution to provide entertainment for, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines stationed overseas to have entertainment. They opened up these rooms on the bases. So I thought, okay, I gambled when I was in my 20s. I had no problem with it. Let me just go and sit down and play for a while because I was tired, but I wasn't ready to sleep. I was very stressed. So I sat down, and it wasn't long before I got relaxed. I started feeling good. I'm like, okay, now maybe I can finally go to sleep later. But then I won. Um, I didn't break the bank. I didn't get thrown out. None of that. I won a good chunk of money. And I can remember, I'm sitting here describing this to you and can still remember in that moment that feeling of all of that weight just falling off and just feeling good in that moment. And while I'm not going to tell you I became addicted in that moment, I'm going to tell you that a seed was planted and that developed over the next course of the next several months into what we'll probably talk about in a bit here became a pretty serious addiction.
Such a common theme of compulsive gamblers, gambling addicts who are now in recovery. It all started with that big win. The worst thing that could have happened was we won early doors. I just want to go into those casino slot rooms a bit more. Was that like open to the public, or that's just like a closed thing to you guys?
It was open. You couldn't get into it unless you could get onto the military base. And that required some form of ID check as you walked into the gate. It wasn't open to just anyone. Now, civilians living on the base, family members, people working there, yeah, they had access to it. But as far as the general community, no.
Was that like a private entity? Like, are they making the people who run that a separate? They don't work for the army. They're making money from. They're making profit from you guys. They're paying you guys out, or is it all within the army sort of thing?
It's all within the Department of Defense structure. They ultimately own the program, if you will. And then they hire a company to manage the machines and the rooms and all that. But then the money goes to what's called the Morale, Welfare, and Recreation Fund, or the MWR. The MWR is a organization within the Department of Defense that provides things like bowling alleys. It provides things like excursions where you can go visit somewhere. It provides entertainment for military service members to give them something to do. And it's kind of a particularly important function overseas because oftentimes people who are overseas, particularly in like Korea or like Okinawa, they can often be stationed there separated from their families. And even if you're there with your family, it can be stressful to be in a foreign country somewhere. So the MWR, the Morale, Welfare, and Recreation, gives you something to do where you can learn about that country or just something to occupy your time with. So it's a very good cause.
Did you experience much of Korea? Did you were you interacting with the locals and stuff, or was it kind of like you were enclosed in your community, if you like?
I used to walk around outside of the gates just to explore my area. There actually was a very large mountain, recreational mountain right off the base. You could walk all the way up the mountain, and there were little shops and things you could do on the way. And I used to walk there and explore on my own, but I never really took an organized trip. They had them. I just never really took them. And as the year went on and my addiction became worse, I more and more isolated myself to the base. So I get down to Busan, I get settled in, I meet all my team, and sure enough, that first Friday night, I went to the what's called the community club. It's the bar and restaurant right there on the base. And as I'm sitting in there, lo and behold, here's another one of these rooms off to the back. This one was much less glitzy. It was much smaller. It was more utility, but it still was a room full of these machines. So I'm like, okay. I enjoyed doing this in Seoul. Let me do this again. That went from going on a Friday night and enjoying it to a Friday and Saturday night to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, till eventually over the course of about 3 months, almost every single night that I had available, I was in that room. Um, it developed from this is fun and this is a nice little escape to I can't not go to this room. And that continued to develop over the year I was there to the point where it got so obsessive, it literally became, I have to go here. So I would take lunch breaks and go. I would tell people I was going to a meeting and I would go. And eventually, of course, I didn't, it went from I won in the beginning to I was losing more than I was winning. So I was running out of money. So I would reach out to my wife at the time, and I'd ask her to send more money to the bank that I had set up there because I was going on this trip or somebody needed help with this. I would come up with a multitude of excuses to get money. But then that only lasted so long until she said, listen, something's not right here. I can't keep sending you money. So that stopped. Then but I mean, the money wasn't there, but the obsession continued to grow. So then I took all the possessions I had. I had a really nice 10-speed bicycle. I had like a touring bike. I had a electronic equipment. I had all this stuff. I sold it. I sold it because I needed the money to continue gambling. And I thought, oh, well, I'll win it back. I'm not worried, you know. Well, of course, that all went away. And that was finite. That was a one-time thing. So then that's when I started to do the things that to this day, when I talk about, I'm embarrassed about. I borrowed from my subordinates, which in most militaries across the world, but particularly I'm going to talk about the US military because that's where I experienced this. If you're a non-commissioned officer, if you're in charge of people, you don't borrow money from your subordinates. You don't do that. These are the people you're in charge of, right? But I did. And then eventually I stole from my own unit. And that was kind of the catalyst of my first trouble with gambling in the military because it wasn't a large amount of money. It was a petty cash fund. And when I took it, of course, what's going through my head is I'll win it back. I'll put it all back. And by this time, it's not happening. By this time, all winning did is extended the amount of time I could stay there. That's all it did. It didn't provide me with more money. It became not about the money anymore. It was about the escape. So, of course, I used all that money which started a criminal investigation division investigation into what I had done. Nobody knew where the money went until I pulled them aside and said, let's go talk. And then I admitted to it because I was so ashamed. I was so, I felt so horrible about what I had done that was so against my character and what I was trying to do in the Army that I just confessed to it. And of course, immediately I was pulled out of my position. Now, I got there in November 2001. Now we're talking October 2002 is when all of this started to happen, right? So I'm nearing the end of my tour. I'm nearing the end of my year there. So naturally, they pulled me out of my position, and rightly so. You can't have somebody doing what I was doing in charge of other people. And then they sent me back up to Seoul to the headquarters to figure out what they were going to do with me. Um, in the meantime, my first sergeant, the enlisted person in charge of me, asked if I needed somebody there with me to put me on suicide watch. Well, if I was feeling suicidal, first of all, I would not have asked anybody to be there with me. So that was kind of a question that was irrelevant. And I understand why she asked. I mean, don't get me wrong, she genuinely cared, right? I just don't know that I would have just assigned somebody instead of asking that question, but that's me. But anyway, I ended up going up to Seoul. I'm doing a silly administrative work until they finally got to sit in front of my commander, who looked at me and said, "We don't know what to do with you because you're doing all of these great things." I got promoted. I earned the expert field medical badge, which in the Army is extremely hard to earn. Um, I got a bunch of other people promoted. I created a training system that they were trying to adopt throughout the peninsula because they liked the way I was doing things. There was all of these good things happening alongside of this obsession. And the way he put it was, you're doing all of these great things, but then there's this character thing and there's this money thing, right? I think in retrospect, the missing piece there, because I didn't even know really what was happening to me. I knew what I was doing. I just didn't know why it was happening. But the missing piece to that conversation was the gambling issue. It was the money issue. It was the character issue. It's a disciplinary issue. It's not a mental health and addiction issue. right? And that, to this day, still within the military system, is not where it needs to be. It's getting better. Please understand, it's getting better, but it has a long way to go until we really understand that this is a mental health issue and an addiction issue and needs to be addressed that way within the system. It doesn't mean people shouldn't be punished for things that they did, for disciplinary things that they did, but balance that with treating it as an addiction, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Um, so then fast forward, I got sent on to my next unit, um, where things quieted down for a while. I got back with my family, but little by little, the addiction began to build up again, to the point where I was in South Carolina with my family, and I came down on orders to go to Texas, to Corpus Christi, Texas. By the time we had reached there, my first wife said to me, "I can't do this anymore. You're going on your own. The children and I are staying here in South Carolina." And at that point, we separated. By this point, I had already had the first of what turned out to be my 4 attempts on my own life. I was going, it was happening almost daily again where I was gambling, and I didn't know what to do. And I figured nobody could ever understand what was happening to me. So I had this bottle of pain medication I had for my back, and I just ended up taking the whole bottle, right, while I was sitting at my desk at my office. Dropped to the floor, ended up in a hospital, and woke up with my wife on one side of me and my boss on the other side of me saying, "You're going to go get help." Um, didn't say what that help looked like. Just so I was stationed away from a military base at that time, so I went to a civilian psychologist, basically told her what I thought she wanted to hear. Then she'd just write stuff down on a little tablet. My wife insisted on going with me, which at the time I wanted nothing to do with, because I wanted to just keep gambling. I didn't want to stop. So I would, shed tears and tell the counselor what she wanted to hear. And then eventually that stopped after a month or two, and things were quiet again, but the gambling never stopped. So like I said, ended up moving down to Texas by myself. The gambling continued to get worse until all the things I did in Korea started to happen again. And I ended up stealing from my own unit again. This time it was a piece of equipment. And again, an investigation got started. And again, I admitted to it. But this time, instead of being just reduced by a rank and sent on my way, this time my commander was letting me out of the Army. They were chaptering me out of the Army, which again, I'm going to tell you was the right thing to do, because my actions did not support who I was or what I was supposed to be, right? Um, but the one thing he said to me, this was kind of the catalyst. I found out that I was being let out of the Army while I was spending 2 weeks in a mental institution, because 2 weeks earlier, I was sitting in my room that I was living in, which had like these brick walls around it. And I cleared a path in the brick walls, and I just started running myself headfirst into the wall, because again, I had no idea what I was doing. And when that didn't work, I just took myself to the hospital and ended up in this mental institution, for 2 weeks. It was an acute psych facility, is what it was, where my officer in charge and my commander showed up and disciplined me right there in the conference room of that facility to tell me I was being let out of the Army. The one thing that he did do, my commander did do, that to this day I'm grateful for, is he said, "We're letting you out under honorable conditions." I could have very easily gotten a dishonorable discharge for what I did. But he said, "We're letting you out under honorable conditions so you can go get the help you need from the VA, from the Veterans Administration." Um, Again, they didn't really describe what that help looked like. They just said, "You can go get that help." And again, to this day, I'm grateful for that, because the VA gambling treatment program, which I later got into, was the beginning of the saving of my life. So I'm extremely grateful for that. So now I'm separated from my wife and kids, and now I'm out of the Army. So I drive back to Pennsylvania. Now, this is 2005. Mind you, I'm 4 years now separated from the beginning of this addiction in 2001. I get to Pennsylvania and it just ignites. I went through 5 different jobs, gambled ridiculously over the next 2 years. I robbed from my employer. I committed a felony. and robbed several $1,000s. And again, before an investigation even got started, turned myself in because of the guilt I felt and the shame I felt for doing it. The catalyst to me finally seeking help was, and I tell this story all the time because I think it's so important to understand how bad this addiction can get. It was a Friday night. I had money in my pocket. I had gotten paid. Um, and I went down to my favorite casino at the time on a Friday night, and I said, okay, I'm just going to sit down and play. And I didn't care how much I spent. I just, I had bills. It didn't matter. So I go in there, and not long after I'm in there, of course, I won. Right. So, but by this point, that winning wasn't about getting money and paying bills and walking out of there with money. That winning, all it did was extended the amount of time I could stay in that casino. So, of course, I played and played and played and played and played until I ran out of money. Not long before I ran out of money, I can remember the feeling of, I can't wait to run out of money, so I can leave here, but I won't leave here until I run out of money. That's how insane it had become at that point. I'm going to say that again. The thought was, I can't wait to run out of money so I can leave. And I'm not going to leave until I run out of money. You know, I mean, just imagine those wacko thoughts going through your head. And I had no idea why. So finally, of course, I did run out of money. And I'm like, okay, I've been here overnight. Let me get into my car, drive home, because it was an hour drive home. Let me go through all the shame that I always go through, do the drive of shame. I got out to the car, I get in the car, I turn on the radio, and I'm hearing Sunday morning music on what I thought was a Saturday morning. Turns out I had been in that casino 36 hours and didn't know it. I thought I was there overnight.
Oh,
I
no.
was there 36 hours. I was so dejected at that point. I drove home. I sat in the parking lot of my local grocery store and I just contemplated, do I want to live? Do I even want to go through this anymore? Why am I even bothering? And sitting next to me was a bottle of antidepressants, which again, I took the whole bottle, right? I thought, this is it. I'm done. Nobody's ever going to understand. Well, I think I realized after I took that bottle that I wasn't trying to end my own life. I was trying to get somebody to understand what was going on with me and give me help, somebody to help me. So I ended up turning myself into a hospital. I was there overnight. I drank a lot of charcoal. It was a very horrible night for me. And of course, they put me on watch the whole 9 yards. I get up the next morning. I realize there's another check sitting in my mailbox at home. So, and I don't know how I got away with this, but I got myself signed out of that hospital against medical advice, of course. Drove back to the mailbox, took the check out, cashed the check, went back to the casino, and 4 hours later, I was broke again. And that's when I knew I had given up. I just gave up trying to understand this. Not long before that, I had been to one of my several visits to the VA where nobody really seemed to know what to do with me except one clinician who reached into the drawer of the desk and pulled out this old packet of papers, shook the dust off it, laid it in front of me. It said VA Gambling Treatment Program, right? And I thought nothing of it when it was first presented to me. Well, after this weekend, after that event, I'm like, okay, I need to call. So I called and I talked to somebody and they did an interview with me and they said, okay, we have a bed for you in June of this year. This was 2007, right? So I drove out to Cleveland, Ohio, which is a 6-hour drive from where I live. That's where the oldest residential gambling treatment of any type in the U.S. was. It was created in 1972 for the Department of Veterans Affairs here in the U.S. And, it's a residential gambling treatment program. At the time, it was in Brecksville, a suburb of Cleveland in Ohio. It's now actually in Cleveland. So I drove out there, and of course, on the way out, I gambled. I had to have my last hurrah before I went into treatment. I get out there, I get weighed in, and this is significant. I'm 6'1", and I normally weigh about anywhere between 195 and about 210 pounds, right? I get out there and get weighed in. I was 165 pounds, and you could see my ribs. That's how bad it had gotten through the gambling I'd done. So I get weighed in, I get in there, I get in front of the first counselor that I'm going to talk to, and within minutes, somebody finally within six, through the 6 years I'd been struggling, somebody finally understood what I was going through. And I finally felt like there was hope and help for me. So that was the beginning of my recovery journey, which was a long and bumpy one. because that was June of 2007. I stayed in Cleveland for another 2 years until 2009. Came back to the States. In the meantime, I'd been divorced from my wife. I had lost contact with my children for 2 years. I hadn't even talked to them for 2 years. They were basically, she took parental rights away from me while I was hospitalized. All of this is happening. I get back to Pennsylvania. I start to reestablish contact with my kids. Things are starting to go good, and I connect with the woman who is now my wife. Turns out she and I were actually high school sweethearts, which that's a whole other story. But this was in 2011 that we connected. What I didn't understand is that because I stopped going to my Gamblers Anonymous meetings, because I stopped going to counseling, because I thought, I got this, I'm cured, slowly but surely the addiction was building back up, right? Over the course of the next several years, it built up to the point where now we're in 2019, and it's the fall of 2019, and it's gotten so bad that I basically took my vehicle, which I had just paid off a few months before, and I basically sold it back to myself by getting a title loan on it so I could go gamble. I bought my own truck for myself so I could go gamble. Fast forward, it's January 3rd of 2020. I had been walking around for the last probably month and a half with a knife in my pocket, that if my wife had ever discovered all the things I was doing with our money, right, that I was going to walk to the back of my property and use that knife. I had an exit plan in place. Well, January 3rd, I said to my wife, I feel sick. I'm going to sit out here in the living room. I don't want to get you sick. So for the entire weekend, I sat on my couch, and that's where I slept. I spent that weekend deciding whether I wanted to live or die. That was what that weekend was for. Well, by the time the weekend was over, I decided I wanted to live and get into treatment, knowing the hell I was about to go through, admitting everything that I had done, and that sort of thing, especially to my wife, who knew nothing. She had no clue what I had done over those several years. So I took myself to my local VA hospital. I said, I want to hurt myself. So of course they're going to take me in, right? I said, but before you take me in, let me make a phone call. So I called my wife. And on that phone call, I told her most of what I had done. Daniel, if I could describe to you the feeling of betrayal in that moment, of me telling her what I had done to her over several years, I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. That will be a moment that I never want to recreate as long as I live. So then I turned myself into the hospital. I spent a week there. I got myself back into Gamblers Anonymous, which I still go to a meeting every single week. I was just there this Wednesday. I go every single Wednesday. I went back to the gambling treatment program for another 5 weeks, right? And this time it was a very different approach, because this time they said to me, what do you want from this program? I said, I want to understand what's beneath the gambling. This needs to be untangled so I can live a better life. Not just stop gambling. I want to live a better life. So I went through that program. I stayed with the counselor from that program for another year and got another local counselor, which I stayed with for a year after that. I go to my Gamblers Anonymous meetings. I started my podcast in 2020 because right after all of this, literally right after I got out of the gambling treatment program, COVID got to the point where nobody could leave anymore here in the US. Everybody's wearing masks. I had to work from home. So, and that was one of the best things that could have ever happened to me, because I started doing online meetings. I couldn't go anywhere even if I wanted to, and I was a casino gambler. It was one of the best things that could have ever happened to me, was being isolated like that. Because I started the podcast, and then I started formulating my book. Now, I had written a self-published book a few years before, and it was a great confessional. It was very cathartic for me, but this time I really dug into who I am, you know, and I really put out on paper the parts of my life that I was afraid to expose to anybody. I think a lot of the reasons, as I look back, that I gambled, I grew up in a very abusive alcoholic home, and I always hid myself from everybody. So I had to become willing to get uncomfortable and share parts of myself that I would never share with anybody, especially with my wife. So I would start to say things to her like, I'm uncomfortable saying this and I need to say it. And in a lot of cases, it was something silly, like I dropped a glass and I broke it, just something silly like that. But yet it was important for me to step into that because the deeper parts of me that I wasn't willing to let go had to start somewhere, right? What I noticed is the more of myself I started to let go, the less the need to do something outside of what I normally do, like gambling or like something frivolous or compulsive, the less that was there, because I felt free. I felt for the first time in my life, I felt transparent and honest about where I was. I've been practicing that for the last 5.5 years, and I still practice it to this day, and it's still on occasion is not comfortable for me, because for many, many, many years of my life, I'm not too far away. I'm a little over a year away from being 60 years old. So you got to remember, for 40 plus years of my life, this is the way I hid. So to uncover that in 5.5 years is not going to be easy, but yet at the same time, I feel more liberated than I've ever felt. You know, do I still hide things on occasion? Yeah, I do, but they're small things, and I usually circle back and go, by the way, I was hiding this from you. I want you to know. I come back later and I confess it, and it feels good. So, today, my entire focus and work is on paying it forward. I did a lot of damage in the military. I wore rank on my collar that should have been above reproach, and yet I wasn't. So now all of my work is focused on, I don't want to say making up for it. I want to say being the person I could have been then. So that's a lot of where I am now.
Okay, before we go into your recovery, just wow, what a story, Dave. That I think it was your third attempt on your life when you've took the pills and the antidepressants in the car. At that point in your story, I'm just rooting for you so bad, and as you're telling that part of it, I'm like, this is the wake up call now. This is going to be the wake up call. And then to hear you, that pay slip was waiting at home, you managed to, I'm like, oh no, Dave, no. It just shows the depths that this addiction takes us to. It's insane. When we look back on it, we can see how insane it was. As we're in it, this is what I want to ask you. You kept sort of confessing. You kept jumping before you were pushed in, I think twice in the army, you said, and another time you'd confess to everything you've done before you got caught, type of thing. What, like looking back now, what are you thinking you're trying to achieve there by doing that? Do you see that as a cry for help, trying to admit to what you've done and trying to get better, but it just never succeeded? Was it just a case of jumping before you got pushed?
No, I think there's two parts to it. Number one is you just described, right? A cry for help. Please, somebody understand me. Please, somebody help me understand what's happening to me. I think that was part of it. I think another part of it is the underlying values of my character. One of the things I've done in my recovery is I dug into a values exercise, and what do I really value in my life? And one of the things that I value is living up to the person that I want to be, being the example that I want to be for others, and being transparent and honest. I value honesty, right? As deceptive as I was, as much as I lied, underneath of it, I valued honesty. And so what I was doing was in direct conflict with who I wanted to be. When I wore my uniform and when I earned the rank that I had in my uniform, I can't tell you how proud I was of achieving what I had achieved, right? So when I did what I did, it was so much in conflict with what I had achieved. There was just this Jekyll and Hyde. And I call this the Jekyll and Hyde addiction because that's what it feels like. There's this person who is achieving and living and loving and taking care of family and working hard and wanting to become a better version of themselves, right alongside of this obsessive, lying, manipulating, obsessive person who just wants to gamble over and over again. And I think that's kind of part of what drove it, was that conflict.
Back in Korea, at the start of your story, you said it took 3 months to go from just a Friday night or a Saturday night to then a Friday and Saturday to then needing it every single day. I want to ask a hypothetical for you. Do you feel if you didn't get that win, that big win, that very first night, do you feel, first of all, that you would have became a cropper to a gambling addiction? Do you feel you were going to get one anyway? And secondly, do you feel it would have caught up with you that fast? Like it took 3 months to go from your first win to full blown addiction. Two-part question. Do you feel you still would have ended up addicted to gambling without that win? And do you feel it still would have progressed as fast without that win?
To answer the first part of your question, I honestly don't know. I can't help but wonder because there was a lot of downtime. I can't help but wonder in those rooms if I would have wandered into another room and then won, and then it would have been triggered, or I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I do know that that win was a huge part of the trigger that got me going. I do know that. I'm convinced of that because of the way it felt when it happened, right? So maybe it would have been some other trigger, or maybe it wouldn't have happened.
Do you feel that that first win is the reason it was so turbocharged? It happened so quickly.
Yes, I 100% believe that because it it accelerated quite quickly. You know, I say over the course of 3 months, but it was probably a month before it started to get some regularity to it, you know? And it was because how good it felt. It was because I was trying to recreate that feeling that I had of not feeling, if that makes sense. You know, of not feeling the stress, of not feeling the anxiety, of not feeling the fear. You know, it was much of what I didn't wanna feel as it was of what I did. And so, yeah,
Escapism.
I think that that was a huge catalyst for it.
Yeah, escaping your feelings. They say when you enter recovery, the best part about recovery is you start feeling your feelings. The worst part about recovery is you start feeling your feelings. You
Yeah,
just described it
amen.
perfectly there in gambling. uh, I'm just thinking while you're that 12 months in Korea, how quickly it's developed, and then you said on your next deployment. Sorry if I'm using the wrong terminology here. On your next deployments, you were it was getting worse and worse, and you borrowed money off your subordinates and that. Are your friends, your co-workers, your fellow army, are they seeing the damage you're doing to yourself? Are you managing to hide this? Are you functioning perfectly well on the outside?
As I look back in the moment, then I had the blinders on, so I couldn't have told you answered that question in the moment. Looking back on it, I believe they knew what was happening. I just don't think they knew how to approach it. Um, you know, I don't think that they knew what to say to me. Um, but if I was in their shoes and what I was doing to them was being done to me, I can tell you I would have been like, "What's going on here? What's happening? What is wrong with this person?" You know? So, did they notice? Yeah, I think they noticed. I do.
The turning point, what finally made you say enough is enough? I don't want to deal with this gambling addiction anymore, and turn your gambling addiction into recovery. Your rock bottom, your lowest moment, was it that conversation that you described earlier with your wife that you said you never ever want to go through again?
No, that was a huge part of the motivation to stay in recovery, to really engage in recovery, but I think the catalyst to the recovery was just this pit feeling of, "I can't do this anymore. I have done so much damage." You know, I am such a low version of who I wanna be. I wanted very badly to end my life. I wanted very badly to just not wake up because I knew I was better than that, and yet I couldn't stop. Um, it was just that conflict of I'm sitting here in the pit and there's no rope. That was really, I think, the catalyst to finally get into recovery was I've given up. I gave up. I gave up trying and I just wanted somebody else to step in and say, "Okay, here you go. Let me help you."
I love what you said before as well. I'm a big advocate of it's not just about stopping gambling. It's not just avoiding gambling. It's about why, finding out why I behaved like this, why my brain is wired to behave like this. So what's the first step that you took to understanding yourself, understanding why you'd put yourself through the gambling?
What was a long and I had mentioned this earlier is I spent a lot of time, particularly when I was at the inpatient facility, the gambling treatment program, trying to untangle what was beneath the gambling. I wanted to understand who I was as a person because I felt like if I better understood me and what brought me to who I am today, I could better understand what drove me to obsessively want to escape and gamble. And I think I cracked it. I cracked the code when I've always been the kind of person who needed to be the funniest or the smartest or the most noticed person in the room, right? Because I always thought that if somebody thought I was smart or thought I was funny, they wouldn't ask more questions. They would let it go. I made a decision while I was in that program to do two things. Number one was shut up and listen, right? To shut up and be the
Great
student
start.
instead of
Great
trying to be
start.
the leader. And number two, when I was asked a question, to sit back and answer it as honestly as I possibly could, even if it hurt. Um, that was my work. That was what I decided the work was going to be. To uncover the gambling was not to uncover gambling, but to uncover who I was and how I could start to live differently.
Lastly, I love the bit that you spoke about having the uncomfortable conversations with your wife, forcing yourself to do it. That was a big part of my gambling, now my recovery. Just gambling was isolating, avoiding those uncomfortable feelings, not dealing with them, going to escape. Whereas now in
Yeah.
recovery, anything that doesn't get spoken about just ends up laying low and builds up resentment. And yeah, I fully encourage those uncomfortable conversations. I try and have them. And similar to yourself, I'm not successful in it today, I can try again in a couple of days. I don't beat myself up for not having it perfect right now. I tell myself it's a work in progress for the rest of my life. I'm never going to get to the finish line. The finish line is me lying on my deathbed. So I don't want to perfect it. I want to progress, not perfection. I want to try and make a little bit of improvement each day if I can.
It's interesting. I just had a conversation about this very thing the other night when I was talking in my Gamblers Anonymous meeting, and I'll never talk about what somebody else said, but I'm willing to talk about what I said. And I said the one thing, the one character defect or issue I'm working on still to this day is perfectionism, right? I'm way better at being okay with making mistakes, but I'm nowhere near perfect. And the one example I brought up was, believe it or not, was golf, right? I'm out playing a golf game. I get two great swings in a row, and then I shank one into the woods, right? And the first thing I want to do is jump up and down and stomp like a little mad kid and throw my clubs into the woods, right? And it's not because the shot was bad, it was because I wasn't perfect. It was because I didn't do what I knew I should have done in that moment, quote unquote, right? The problem is golf is the worst possible example of a sport you could ever pick for perfectionism because even the best players of the world have make mistakes. So of course, but it's a great kind of an example of a way to become okay with not being perfect. You know, it's a way to practice standing back and going, okay, that just happened. Instead of, you idiot, you did it again. What's wrong with you? It's a great way to step back and go, well, that just happened. You know, let me try again. And so it's funny you brought that up because for me, I still work on that to this day. But I guess the more important thing is I'm aware of it and I do the work, and that's for me is the most important part. Am I doing the work? Am I continuing to try to become a better version of me? You know?
That's it. Perfection doesn't exist. Progress and trying your best is good enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So you have been in recovery since 2020. We're now in 2025 at the time of recording, so 5 years. What have been the biggest challenges in your recovery so far? And how have you handled them? How have you overcame them?
My own ego, because after I got into recovery, I turned over all my finances to my wife. I have no access to money to this day. um, the hardest thing for me to overcome is when I'm questioned on something that I do now. So, if I do something or say something and my wife, she's way, way, way better at this than she was in the beginning because she did not trust me to begin with. I'm grateful that she's still with me. Let me say that. But there are times when I'll say something or I'll go somewhere and she'll be like, "Hey, you didn't give me a receipt. Are you sure that's what you were doing?" And my first reaction, I want my first reaction to be, why don't you trust me? It's been 5.5 years, right? But I have to step back and I have to go, okay, let me stop for a second. Let me think about this. No, I can understand why you said that. Here's what I did. Here's what's going on. She's much better at saying, okay, all right, thank you, than she was in the beginning. But there are still moments when she asks me a question and I get that kind of that shock feeling of, oh, what am I going to say? And then I go, wait a minute, let me tell the truth because that's what I did. There's still those moments for me. Even this many years into it, there's still those moments of hiding. So that's still the part I think I work on. The rest of it, my life is good. My life is good. I have grandkids now. I want my legacy for them to just know me as their grandfather, not the guy who runs away or hides or lies or anything like that. Just being their grandfather. For my wife, I just want to be as honest with her as I can possibly be, and everybody around me. But there are moments. There are moments when I remember that I'm in recovery. There are moments that remind me that I'm still in recovery. You know.
I was nodding along like a pigeon pecking at the street. I've got the exact same thing with my wife, where my knee-jerk reaction is, how dare you question me? And then as soon as I process it, I'm like, everything I've put her through, she's fully entitled to question me, and I'm completely fine with it. We've got
Yep.
just so many similarities so far in our stories, Dave. It's unbelievable. You mentioned your grandkids there. What about your kids? How's your relationship been with two kids? I think you said since you've
Yep.
gone into
And
recovery.
they were very young when I lost access to them. I started talking to them again when they were probably 9, 10, 11 years old, in that area. And now my daughter lives 10 minutes away with my grandkids, so I get to see them all the time. In fact, I'm going to see them tomorrow. They're going to be over for a picnic. My son lives in our house right now. He moved up from South Carolina after he finished school so he can, find a full-time job because he just finished his master's degree, and then he can find his own place to live. So he's just hanging with us for a while. So my relationship now with my children is everything. It's so meaningful. They're both adults now, but I've had conversations with them both about the entire journey, and both of them know I never stopped thinking about them. Through all those years, I never stopped thinking about them. So that relationship is magnificent now. It's great. And I'm so grateful for that.
I love to hear it. I love to hear it. It's so heartwarming, Dave. Amazing. Right, with your recovery moving forward, how do you maintain your recovery? I know you've mentioned Gamblers Anonymous meetings there. Tell me what you do to make sure you stay on this path.
Well, that's part one. Is every single week I have a touch point I go to, which is my GA meeting. And I make sure that no matter what the topic, I turn it inward when I'm talking, right? That's my time to talk about me and maybe what I'm struggling with, or maybe with the successes. I always make sure that I use that as a touch point to be honest about where I am. I also work as a behavioral health coach. So I work with people in recovery from gambling every single day. I've got, 10 or 15 coaching clients I work with that, it allows me to help them on their journey, and I get to see them in different points in their journey, but it also helps me in my own journey. Every Tuesday night, I facilitate a peer-run problem gambling support group, through the organization I work with. So I get to do that. I tour all over. I go all over the country telling my story in different places. So I'll have groups bring me in to tell my story. So, and that to me is another way to maintain recovery. I serve on the board of directors for the National Council on Problem Gambling and also for the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling in Washington State. And then I do consultation work right here in Pennsylvania for my own council, the Council on Compulsive Gambling of Pennsylvania here in PA. So the way I maintain recovery is my life revolves around, gambling harm prevention, gambling harm awareness, all of those sorts of things. I kind of live in this world, and it keeps me healthy and it keeps me accountable.
Say, wow, it seems 7 days a week you keep yourself accountable and you maintain it. But I love to hear of the cycle of giving back. Whereas when we were gambling, it was just a horrible cycle of escapism, getting money to gamble with, losing that money, needing more money to fix that was just a horrible cycle. But then the recovery cycle that you've just spoke of, where you're now using your lived experience to help others get out of the mess that you were in, and then they will get into recovery and they can help others. I just love to hear it. So thank you for all the amazing work that you do, Dave. It's greatly appreciated. Tell me more about the book that you wrote in 2020?
I released it in 2023. I released the audiobook version of it this past May. The book title is Fall In, A Veteran with a Gambling Addiction. The title Fall In actually comes from a military term when everybody's clustered around in the morning before the first formation, and then the leader says fall in, and everybody gathers into the formation. But the double meaning of that is falling into the pit of despair, which is what I did. Here's the thing. The very first line of the book and the very last line of the book are the same. This is a story of hope. Here's why I wrote this book. All right. I can remember a point in my addiction thinking, and this was many points, it wasn't just one, where I thought nobody could ever understand the insane things that are happening to me and the insane thoughts I'm going through right now. Right. I wrote this book so that somebody who might be going through that same thing can say, oh, wait, maybe somebody can understand. Maybe there is hope for me. That's why I wrote this. I wrote this to let people know this is very real. This is very dangerous, but also you can get through it and you can move beyond the gambling and into recovery. That's why I wrote it. Yes, there are parts of my story that I wanted to talk about me because it was cathartic for me to get it out, right? Yet at the same time, it was also with the intent that somewhere along the line, somebody can read that or listen to it and connect with it and say, you know, let me reach out. Maybe there's hope for me. That's the whole idea behind it.
I love the matching opening and closing line. Such a powerful statement. Brilliant. Where can people find the book? Where can they find the audiobook?
The paperback version is available on Amazon.com. It's available on BarnesandNoble.com, and then there's other. If you just Google "Fall In: A Veteran with a Gambling Addiction" or Dave Yeager "Fall In," it'll come up. You can access it through my website, which is daveyeager-fallin.com. Or the audio book is available either on Apple Music or it's available on Audible as well.
Just check the description out below. There'll be links to everything Dave just mentioned there, and also a link to Dave's podcast as well. Fall In, the podcast with Dave Yeager. Dave, what are you hoping people are going to take away from sitting here with us today, listening to your story?
Number one, if you're somebody listening that is trying to find a different way or a better way, there's hope and you can do it, right? Number two, those of us have been through addiction and are on the other side of it, we're good people. We're real people. We just struggle with a very real mental health issue. This thing, disordered gambling, problem gambling, gambling addiction, whatever term you want to apply to it, is a very real addiction and it's treatable. So I think that's the take-home message from this is if you're not sure, reach out to somebody and ask.
Brilliant. I love it. And it's funny you should say that. We're good people. We struggle with this addiction. That came through so much as I was listening to your story. I could feel how torn you were. I just chatting to you briefly before this recording and just listening to you on this recording, I can see you're an amazing person and you've got amazing morals, and you were just caught up in the addiction, and I can see it was just tearing you apart. And yeah, it was. I was rooting for you the whole way. And Dave, I'm just so glad that you're out the other side now. You're so deep into your recovery and you're giving back, and you've been here with me today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat. However, before I let you go, I'm going to ask one bonus question. If money was no object and you could do any job in the world, what would you do and why?
Money was no object, and I could do any job in the world. I'm going to be honest. I would go around and speak. I love standing in front of people and watching people's eyes light up when I say something that they weren't aware of, when that aha moment takes place. That is the most meaningful moment in the world to me. When I was younger, I acted. I loved acting because I loved watching an audience react to what we did on stage. And part of that's, ego. I like attention. I'm not going to lie. I like attention. But a bigger part of that is I love watching somebody receive something that they weren't aware of, that they're go, ooh, I wasn't aware of that. This is cool. I want to know more. That standing in front of a group of people and getting that sort of a reaction or watching people's faces light up like that, you can't pay me enough money to feel like that.
I
There's
hope
no amount of money that provides meaning for me and satisfaction for me like that does.
I hope you enjoyed seeing my eyes go like this and my ooze for the entire length of this video, Dave. A brilliant way to finish. Thank you once again for your time today. I have thoroughly enjoyed this chat we've had.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's an honor for me to be able to do this.
The video on the screen right now is my sit down with Christina Cook from the Broke Girl Society. Give that a click and I will see you over there.